This is a Fox News alert. We have been keeping an eye on the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing this morning. You see the Director of National Intelligence, former Senator Coates, there testifying this morning. And we understand, as we expected, that a very hot topic has already come up in this morning's conversation. That hearing there on the Hill, reports that the president approached DNI Coates about pushing back publicly on a story that there was any collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. The reports are from the Washington Post that both he and Mike Rogers, who heads up NSA, were asked to push back publicly and both declined. We've got a bit of what Coates had to say about that short time ago.
2016 elections, Coates and Rogers refused to comply with a request which they both deemed to be inappropriate. Yeah. Is that an accurate reporting, Director Coates?
Mr. Chairman, as the President's principal intelligence advisor, I'm fortunate to be able and need to spend a significant amount of time with the President discussing national security interest and intelligence as it relates to those interests. We discuss a number of topics on a very regular basis. I have always believed that given the nature of my position and the information in which we share, it's not appropriate for me to comment publicly on any of that. So on this topic, as well as other topics, I don't feel it's appropriate to characterize discussions and conversations with the President.
And isn't it true that some of these leaks can be damaging to national security, Director Coates?
Leaks have become a very significant, played a very significant negative role relative to our national security. The release of information not only undermines confidence in our allies about our ability to maintain secure information that we share with them. It jeopardizes sources and methods that are invaluable to our ability to find out what's going on and what those threats are.
In light of the
lives are at stake in many instances, and leaks jeopardize those lives.
Thank you.
You've been listening in there to the Senate hearing. Now we go to the other side of the Hill.
Paul Ryan addressing the tragedy in Manchester. Let's listen.
The whole House of Representatives to Prime Minister May and her government. We stand ready to help in any way we can, because freedom, compassion, and peace will always prevail over violence and hate.
In the face of heinous acts of violence, we must stand united against those who want to harm us, our allies, and our way of life, especially, as you've just heard from the Speaker, when they put young, innocent lives in their crosshairs. My heart and my prayers, along with those of my colleagues, are with the victims, the family, the friends of those killed, law enforcement officers who continue to work to investigate this despicable act, and to reunite the families, as the Speaker just said, separated in the chaos last night. It is our responsibility to protect our children, and it's government's first job to protect our citizens. That's why I've joined a bipartisan group of colleagues to offer a bill, which is what we intended to come out and talk about this morning initially. It's called Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act. Unfortunately, under the current law, amateur athletic governing bodies, organizations responsible for training our Olympic hopefuls, claimed that they had not been required to promptly report allegations of sexual abuse that they received to the law enforcement authorities. Most recently, the Indianapolis Star investigative report uncovered that over the last 20 years, at least 368 children, Olympic hopefuls, reported instances of abuse to USA Gymnastics, based in Indianapolis. But USA Gymnastics allowed these allegations to remain dormant and unreported to law enforcement. Our bill ensures that national governing bodies Olympians promptly report any allegations of physical abuse to law enforcement and implement much stronger policies and procedures to prevent abuse of coaches.
You've been listening in to the House leadership. They're speaking as they do the GOP side of their weekly presser. We will continue to monitor that as we get more news from that. In the meantime, we want to turn back to the events in Manchester last night and bring in Dr. Waleed Phares, a Fox News national security and foreign affairs analyst. Doctor, thank you for joining us this morning.
Sure.
I want to ask you about some of course, this has been the theme of the president's entire trip thus far, combating extremism and terrorism. He used very specific language in talking about this tragic attack in Manchester. He says, I'm not going to call these people monsters because that's what they want. Instead, I'm going to call them evil losers. How does that psychological, that choice affect the psychology of those who are drawn into this activity?
Well, Shannon, the massacre in Manchester, like the one in Paris, in California, and Orlando, compels us, leaders and citizens, to act and think about it. Acting, for example, the State Department would issue a warning not to travel. Stating important changes in narrative, like the president, maybe congressional leaders, all of that is important. It is a reaction. But thinking about it is very important, meaning what is it that we can do, governments can do, to detect before it happens, and what is it that we can do to affect the formation of these jihadists. These are the two fields. It's unescapable. We have to address them, and this event, this tragic event, will force us to do so.
Yeah, the president talked about the fact that in speaking in Saudi Arabia and in Israel over the weekend, saying, I'm not here to lecture you, but this is about us assisting you. You've got to be the ones to drive this out of your holy places, out of your country, out of your society. How do they do that? How do we help them do that?
Actually, the president's speech in Riyadh and all the declarations that were issued after that is the absolute right thing to do. But it's 8 to 10 years late. Meaning, had we done that in the years that followed 9/11, or at least immediately after the Arab Spring, that is to address the Arab and Muslim world, to ask them to form a coalition. You know, the next day, this conference in Riyadh declared that they're going to put an army of 34,000 troops. They declared the same day that they are launching this counter-extremist centers. These are measures that we should have done years ago. So I am confident that the president is leading the right track. But we need to catch up. We need to catch up. The Arab governments need to catch up. Unfortunately, we're going to be attacked until we are ready to counter strategically.
So how do we do that? Is it too late for some of these measures that we're now investing in? What else should we be investing in looking ahead?
We are late, like in every major conflict, in World War I, World War II, and in certain measure in the Cold War. We are late, that we understand. But what is important is to understand that we are late, so that the measures we're going to be taking are going to be very important, such as there is a consensus among experts that we need to end ISIS in Syria and Iraq and partially in Libya. Number two, we need to have a new narrative. It's important that President Trump would say it. More important that the 50 Arab Muslim leaders will start saying it over the next weeks and months. And then, of course, we have a different strategy in the West. I mean, in Britain, in America, in France. Even if Mosul and Raqqa will fall, we still are dealing with an army of jihadists, of individual jihadists or of cells. So it's still ahead of us. The challenge is ahead of us.
We talked earlier with a couple of guests about the numbers that are staggering in Europe of those who have left, gone to the battlefields, become hardened, become trained, have then seamlessly gone right back into society. Tracking them is nearly impossible because there are thousands of open cases all across Europe and here in the U.S. as well. So for those who are already back and infiltrated into the society, what is our best hope for rooting them out before they attack from within?
You're going to send the antidote. I mean, these individuals, though they are in the thousands across Europe and perhaps here in North America, they don't gather together. They don't march as brigades. They're not like ISIS in Syria and Iraq. They are dispersed. They are individuals. So you need to track them in a different space, in the intellectual space. You need to send in NGOs, go online, find them. Most importantly, you need to educate the public, inform, educate the public. Then you have a much wider system that would track them. Not just law enforcement, the public and these communities as well need to be very helpful to us.
Yeah, and we know that we've heard, as in the Bernardino case, San Bernardino in California, there were people who had concerns and and were afraid to raise them for fear of looking like they were judgmental or racist or those kinds of things. But it is really all of our jobs. Dr. Waleed Faraz, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Well, meanwhile, Shannon, while all this is going on Capitol Hill, it's a very busy day. Former CIA Director John Brennan, well, he's testifying on Capitol Hill. That is now getting underway at this hour. You see him there. He's appearing before the House Intelligence Committee on Russia's interference in our presidential election. We'll have a lot on that. Meanwhile, the hearing going on there follows this guy, James Comey. Well, he wants to speak with Special Counsel Robert Mueller overseeing the Russian probe. But before he talks publicly on the Hill, he wants to talk to the special counsel. We'll bring you the latest reaction on that.
Plus, President Trump taking new action against al-Qaeda in Yemen. Ahead, the latest military operation there on the ground. And throughout the morning on America's Newsroom, we will have continuing coverage of that horrible, deadly bombing in Manchester. Just ahead, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, there he is, Congressman Michael McCaul of Texas, will join us about whether or not a similar attack can happen here.
I was at the Ariana Grande concert, and we literally left the concert, and that's when we heard this explosion or this bang go off. And I literally just grabbed my cousin, and I was just like, get off, like, get out. Everybody was screaming.
Well, he's getting to it right now on Capitol Hill. That's former CIA Director John Brennan testifying. He's in front of the House Intelligence Committee. The subject, Russian interference in our presidential election. Let's hear what he has to say.
Entirely consistent with the main judgments contained in the January classified and unclassified assessments, namely that Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton and harm her electability and potential presidency, and to help President Trump's election chances. Let me conclude by saying that it was a very special privilege to serve as a CIA officer for the first 25 years of my public service. And it was the highest honor of my professional career, and always will be, to have served another 4 years as director of CIA. CIA officers of all disciplines, past, present, and future, serve this country and their fellow citizens with tremendous dedication, talent, and courage. They recognize that this country's national security rests heavily on their continued outstanding work and on the sacrifices they and their families make every day on behalf of their fellow citizens. We all owe a great debt of gratitude to all CIA officers and their families for what they have done and continue to do to protect this country. And I will now be pleased to take your questions.
Well, again, Mr. Brennan, thank you very much for your long service, distinguished, and for agreeing to come this morning. I'm joined on our task force by two able prosecutors who I'd like to yield my 5 minutes to Tom Rooney. Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, if you could just take a quick minute before I start with my line of questioning with regard to what happened last night in Manchester, to do whatever you can, the best you can from your expert opinion, to try to reassure the American people that what we do in this country and what we're trying to do would help thwart and stop any kind of similar activity here in the future. If you could help try to put American minds at ease briefly, I would appreciate any words that you might have of advice.
Well, I would say that ISIS and al-Qaeda and their terrorist affiliates continue to try to carry out these outrageous attacks in Europe as well as in the United States. But I can say with great confidence that this country has the absolute best counterterrorism community that knits together the experts from intelligence, law enforcement, homeland security, and does a great job of making sure that our federal structure is interoperating as best it can with state and local officials and local law enforcement. And so I have seen a tremendous, tremendous growth of capability, as well as an enhanced national architecture since 9/11 in terms of the ability to share counterterrorism information quickly, terrorist threat information, so that when it's collected overseas or wherever, it gets to those individuals who have to take action on it. So I can assure the American people that I know today my former colleagues are working even harder than they ever have before to prevent attacks.
Thank you, sir. And to the matter at hand, we heard the ranking member speak in his opening, as well as we've heard in the press numerous times with regard to, and in your opening statement, the Russian investigation, what the Russians were trying to do with regard to our election, the Russians interfering with our election, whether it be through the RT or propaganda or whatever. We know that that has now, unfortunately, become the new norm and something that we're all going to have to deal with. And our charge on this committee isn't so much necessarily to try to seek out and root out criminal behavior, especially now in light of the new special counsel, Robert Mueller, who would be looking into those type of things. But for us on the intelligence committees, whether it be here or in the Senate, to try to improve the intelligence community's ability to do our jobs and to make a report, a recommendation to you and the new administration as to how we better defend ourselves against what Russia and or others may be trying to do with regard to affecting our republic and our democracy. And in doing so, if we do find any kind of criminal behavior, I think that the minority would agree that those type of that type of information would be referred to the Justice Department, which is the proper jurisdiction. But with regard to the main question at hand, in your experience with the Russian trying to involve themselves in our election, did you ever find any evidence, as the ranking member spoke of collusion while you were the director, did you find direct evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Putin in Moscow while you were there?
Mr. Rooney, I never was an FBI agent. I never was a prosecutor, so I really don't do evidence. I do intelligence throughout the course of my career. As an intelligence professional, what we try to do is to make sure that we provide all relevant information to the Bureau if there is an investigation underway that they are looking into criminal activity. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I was convinced in the summer that the Russians were trying to interfere in the election. And they were very aggressive. It was a multifaceted effort. And I wanted to make sure that we were able to expose as much of that as possible.
But was there intelligence that said that the Trump campaign was colluding with Moscow during their campaign?
There was intelligence that the Russian intelligence services were actively involved in this effort. And having been involved in many counterintelligence cases in the past, I know what the Russians try to do. They try to suborn individuals. And they try to get individuals, including U.S. persons, to act on their behalf either wittingly or unwittingly. And I was worried by a number of the contacts that the Russians had with U.S. persons, and so therefore, by the time I left office on January 20th, I had unresolved questions in my mind as to whether or not the Russians had been successful in getting U.S. persons involved in the campaign or not to work on their behalf, again, either in a witting or unwitting fashion. And so, therefore, I felt as though the FBI investigation was certainly well-founded and needed to look into those issues.
When you talk about, and I'm running out of time, but hopefully I'll be able to circle back, can you describe their capabilities beyond just propaganda and actual infiltrating, whether or not there was, you had intelligence to infiltrate the campaign with capabilities beyond just propaganda and beyond just reaching out or trying to influence the news or the campaign, and how long have we known about these type of capabilities?
There's a lot of intelligence that's been built up over the years about Russia's MO in terms of trying to gain influence in Western democracies, how they've been able to use individuals, they've been able to use politicians, political parties, they've been able to use elements within the media to try to make sure that their objectives are realized. And so, again, knowing what the Russian MO is and has been, including in elections in Europe, I certainly was concerned that they were practicing the same types of activities here in the United States. And that's why, as I said, we set up a group in late July that included the FBI and NSA. I wanted to make sure that every information and bit of intelligence that we had was shared with the Bureau so that they could take it. It was well beyond my mandate as director of CIA to follow on any of those leads that involved U.S. persons. But I made sure that anything that was involving U.S. persons, including anything involving the individuals involved in the Trump campaign, was shared with the Bureau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's the former CIA Director John Brennan, of course, threading the needle pretty carefully there. He said Russia was aggressive in the election interference, but clearly when it comes to the potential allegation of collusion, by the Trump campaign with the Russians. He was not able to specifically pin that down, saying it left some unresolved questions, clearly indicating, as we know, that the Russians tried to reach out, perhaps tried to influence U.S. persons. As he said, there's the allegation that one of those U.S. persons was former General Mike Flynn, who has denied any wrongdoing. But there's Adam Schiff, by the way, so let's listen to what he has to say.
Are you aware of any efforts the President has made to enlist the support of intelligence community personnel to push back on a narrative involving the collusion issue that Mr. Rooney was asking about?
I am unaware of it.
I want to ask you about the allegations concerning the President's meetings in the White House, in the Oval Office with the Russians. First, what concerns you might have if the allegations are accurate about sharing information that we may have obtained from an intelligence partner. What impact do you think that might have on not only that partner, but other intelligence partners' willingness to share intelligence with the United States? But more than that, if you could also shed your insights on one other thing, and that is the Russians' reaction to that meeting was at least twofold. One was Vladimir Putin's offer to validate what happened in the Oval Office, to provide his own transcript of that meeting, but also the Russian publication of photographs from that meeting. The Russians had to understand that the publication of those photos would be harmful to the President, or the President would have invited American press into that meeting. What do you think motivated the Russians to publish those photos? What do you think motivated Putin to make a claim he knew would never be accepted, to provide their own transcript of that meeting? Is this just further efforts to weaken the President, disrupt our political process? How do you explain those events?
A lot of questions there, Mr. Schiff. The first point I'd like to make is that I shared classified information with the Russians while I was director of CIA. CIA, on a routine basis, shares classified information with Russians on terrorism matters. It doesn't mean that it becomes unclassified. It means that it retains the classification, but is releasable then to Russia or to other partners. So that in itself is not unprecedented. And I don't know what was shared or said in the Oval Office, but if the reports in the press are true that Mr. Trump decided to spontaneously share some intelligence with the Russians, I think he would have basically violated two protocols. And those two protocols are, one is that such intelligence, classified intelligence, is not shared with visiting foreign ministers or local ambassadors. It's shared through intelligence channels because it needs to be handled the right way, and it needs to make sure that it is not exposed. He didn't do that, if the press charges are accurate. Secondly, before sharing any classified intelligence with foreign partners, it needs to go back to the originating agency to make sure that the language in it is not, even just providing the substance, going to reveal sources and methods and compromise the future collection capability. So it appears as though, at least from the press reports, that neither did it go in the proper channels, nor did the originating agency have the opportunity to clear language for it. So that is a problem. What I was very concerned about, though, is the subsequent releases of what appears to be classified information purporting to point to the originator of the information, liaison partners. These continue to be very, very damaging leaks, and I find them appalling, and they need to be tracked down. So that was where the damage came from, I think, that it was released in the press. Now, the Russians are watching very carefully what's going on in Washington right now, and they will try to exploit it for their own purposes and to see whether or not they can further, I think, seed partisan animosity here in Washington and try to roil the waters, the political waters here. And so even though the election is over, I think Mr. Putin and Russian intelligence services are trying to actively exploit what is going on now in Washington to their benefit and to our detriment.
Falpa, again, on Mr. Rooney's questions. When you had these concerns raised about the Russian efforts and their potential effort to suborn U.S. persons to their cause in the hacking operation, did you take steps to set up an organizational structure to analyze the Russian campaign so that members of the FBI, CIA, NSA, and other agencies would look at these allegations in a cohesive fashion?
Yes, and I also recognize that this was an exceptionally sensitive issue, an active counterintelligence case. trying to stop and uncover what the Russian intelligence activities were in the midst of a hotly debated presidential campaign. That included information that may have involved U.S. persons' contacts with Russia, whether they be benign or not. And so therefore, one of the key pieces of any type of counterintelligence effort is to compartment that effort so that your operators, your investigators, your collectors can continue to uncover what the Russians were doing. We set up a group within CIA. I spoke to Jim Comey, I spoke to Mike Rogers to make sure that they were able to send over their experts so that they could share information among them, even the most sensitive information that was not disseminated within the community. I wanted to make sure that, learning the lessons of 9/11, that there were not going to be any stovepipes and barriers to sharing information from the intelligence and law enforcement communities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, unpacking a lot from former CIA Director John Brennan testifying, saying, for example, that potentially the president could have violated some internal rules if the press reports are correct about his meeting with the Russians, also talking about the Russian interference in the presidential election. He also offered words of reassurance to our country in the wake of the attack in Manchester. Joined now by Texas Congressman Michael McCaul. He is chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee and member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining us after the horrible events. I mean, it can happen here. I mean, you go to the airport, you stand on the sidewalk. Before you get to security, you look both ways and wonder. You go to the mall, you know, you stand in line for a show. That's the soft area target where this apparently happened. Can we better protect ourselves from an occurrence of this here in our country?
Well, we are, Eric, but we really can't stop all of it. And we know every day messages are coming out of Raqqa, Syria, which no doubt impacted this case in Manchester to attack. And it's not just hard targets, it's mainly soft targets, like what we saw at the Boston bombing, a sporting event. They also like to attack concert events. They did that in Paris, in the Paris attacks. And honestly, I don't think there's any coincidence that this attack occurred at the exact same time the President of the United States was visiting, talking about the threats of radical Islamist terror to not only the region, but to Europe and to the United States. And I think this is probably a direct response to that.
He also asked and urged the Muslim nations in their own culture and in their own communities, in their mosques, for moderate Muslims to speak out, for the governments to take action. Do you think you can change that culture?
Well, we have to. And I think the president's remarks, that's probably the best speech I've seen him give, reaching out to the Muslim community. At the end of the day, the solution lies with them. They have to step up to the plate and clean up their own religion, which has been perverted by this radical Islamist terror. And so I think it was a profound meeting the president had with the Saudis, then to go to Israel, and then to the Vatican, really looking at the three major faiths in the world stemming from Abraham, trying to reconcile the three religions so we don't have this terror. But unfortunately, Eric, in our lifetime, it's not going to end. This ideology is way too strong, and we're going to see more of these attacks in the future.
Yeah, and sadly, I mean, we had the Minnesota stabbing attack just last year. Quickly, Congressman, we're running out of time. I apologize. What do we do?
Well, I think we make sure that these, as we squeeze the caliphate and foreign fighters come out of the region, we ensure that they don't get into the United States. We know 10,000 of them came from Europe. We know that they're going back to Europe right now, which is a huge threat to Europe. We'll make sure, and I had a task force to look at foreign travel of terrorists to keep these terrorists from coming in and entering into the United States and conducting what we just saw in Manchester.
Congressman Michael McCaul, thank you, and thank you for your service as our intelligence service is, as we see John Brennan testifying to try and protect us from the similar horrible attacks that occurred in Manchester. Let's listen to John Brennan's testimony.
Existed, I don't know. But I know that there was a sufficient basis of information and intelligence that required further investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not U.S. persons were actively conspiring, colluding with Russian officials.
Do you know the basis of that information that you share with the Bureau? I mean, what was the nature of the evidence?
I think, Mr. Gowdy, this committee has now been provided information that relates to that issue in terms of information that the agency shared with the Bureau, and that is something that is appropriately classified.
All right, and you learned that when in this chronology did you learn of the contacts between these official members of the Trump campaign, or because there's kind of a tripartite hierarchy. There's Trump himself, there are official members of the campaign, and then there are folks who represented themselves as being connected with him.
I'm not going to try to identify individuals nor try to parse it.
I don't want you to parse it. I just want you to identify the individuals. I don't want you to parse it.
I'm not going to identify the individuals because this is information that, again, is based on classified sources and intelligence.
Were they official members of the campaign?
I'm going to defer to current agency officials to be able to further provide to you information related to that. But my understanding is that this committee has access to the documents that we would have provided to the Bureau.
All right. Last question, because I'm out of time. We can use the word evidence. We both know what the other one's talking about. How did you test, probe, examine, cross-examine, otherwise test the reliability or believability, credibility of that evidence you uncovered?
I made sure that the components within CIA that have responsible for counterintelligence, cyber, and Russia were actively working to understand as much as possible about the reliability, accuracy of the information that they already collected and the information that was available that needed further corroboration.
We'll come back to the next round.
Too much time expired. Mr. Himes, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Brennan, for being here. It's good to see you again. I want to use my 5 minutes to try to paint a more specific picture around the methods and mechanisms that the Russians use to suborn, which is the word that you used and that we've used here today, our democracy and our electoral process. And I want to start with a quote by a report I know you're familiar with, CSIS's report, The Kremlin Playbook, in which they say that Russia, quote, seeks to corrode democracy from within by deepening political divides, unquote. The Russians stir the pot, heighten anxieties, and know that when they trigger chaos, even if it ends up negatively affecting them, that they are serving the purpose of weakening us. I want to talk about people because you made reference to people, and I don't want to do it specifically. I want to do it in the abstract. The Kremlin playbook that I just referred to says further that Russia looks to corrode democracy by, quote, investing in rising politicians, cultivating relationships with prominent businessmen, or helping to ensure that its business affiliates become well-positioned in government. Mr. Brennan, assuming that you agree with that, how specifically has the Kremlin...
All right, you've been listening into the House Intelligence Committee hearing today. The featured guest today is former CIA Director John Brennan. Let's go now for more reaction to all of these events going on. We have Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, member of both the Homeland Security and Foreign Relations Committees. Senator, thank you for joining us. I just want to get your initial take on what we're seeing out of Manchester.
You know, I think it's horrifying, and it shows us that we're never really safe at any moment, either in Europe or I think even also here. Also, I think it illustrates what we really need to do is our first line of defense, I think, is protecting our borders. We have to be very careful who we let visit our country. We also have to be very careful who we let come to live in our country. And I want, you know, to have a great mixture of people from around the world allowed to come. But we've got to have the safety of our country. We have to be very concerned about that. And I think that this is more evidence. We don't know if this was an immigrant or not, but it is evidence that we do need to control our borders and be very aware of who comes and who goes.
Well, and yet, as you know, the president's, well, at least the second iteration of his so-called travel ban is tied up in legal maneuvering and may end up going to the Supreme Court, but it's on hold for now. There are countries on that list that were selected by the previous administration because of their concerns about the terror threat from those countries. And yet there are many people in this country who say having any type of ban or freeze like that is discriminatory and cannot stand.
Well, I think you can do both. I've offered something similar to what the president has talked about, but I also offered a way for frequent travelers to get part of a program. We have something called global entry. It's kind of like frequent traveler program that you have here, you know, in the country. I'd like to do that internationally. I think even in countries that we perceive as risks, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Syria, we could find people who are traditional businessmen and women. They could go through a background check. And I think even in those countries that have risk for us, I think we could find a good known traveler program, a frequent flyer program. And I think that would also help it probably eventually pass legal muster if we sort of try to, I guess, internationalize this global entry so known travelers could still travel.
It's very convenient, saves a lot of time. There is a background vetting process, but in so many of these cases, what critics worry about with foreign countries is that we rely on them for a good chunk of that vetting. Is there a way you think we could do that reliably, being able to be confident of the information they collect on these individuals that is then provided to us or to an international body or system?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we could do. For example, even with a country that we have a great deal of adversity with, Iran, there are people who are Iranian Americans whose mother-in-law, sister-in-law, cousin would like to come. And I think if they had a sponsor in this country, we should figure out a way to have a known traveler. You know, having a sponsor in the country makes all the difference in the world. If you're a 19-year-old male with one name coming from the Middle East, we might want to be worried. But if you're a 85-year-old mother-in-law of somebody and someone vouches for you in this country, we should get them into a frequent traveler program and allow ease of transfer back and forth. And this could be in a variety of countries, but we can't just have an open border with the Middle East. We do have to have more scrutiny, particularly for the random traveler who there aren't people there to vouch for. But a lot of security isn't necessarily checking you when you get on the plane. We have to do some of that, but it really should be checking who you are, who you know, who you're related to, and doing a little bit of a background check, because there are people who, for cultural reasons, educational reasons, we want to exchange with the Middle East. And I think you could have both more scrutiny and a frequent traveler program.
I want to ask you about something else that you're very passionate about these days, and that is getting the U.S. out of that Paris climate agreement. Plenty of critics of it say it's not good for the U.S. Are we bound by it? What's your plan?
There's a couple reasons why we should get out of the Paris Accord, and I've introduced legislation asking President Trump to get us out of the Paris Accord. We were gotten into it by President Obama. Congress didn't vote on it. So I object to signing away basically our rights to some international body when Congress doesn't even vote on it. There are estimates that we could lose over 6 million jobs in the Paris Accord, and it's going to cost $3 trillion. That's not good for my state of Kentucky, but it's also just not good for the United States, and no one person should have so much power. We should never let the president, I don't care whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, have so much power to commit so many resources. And it's incredibly unfair. I mean, we're treated differently than every other country. Why would we agree to more severe rules than every other country?
Well, this president has expressed very heightened skepticism about that deal and whether we stay a part of it. So we will watch, and we'll watch your legislation as well. Senator Rand Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And let's now go back to the House Intel Committee. John Brennan, Pete King, Republican of New York.
That is the traditional way that these assessments are drafted, are coordinated, and are published.
And again, without even getting to the final conclusion, if there were other evidence, though, that indicated contrary, should that have been listed or not?
You're dealing with a lot of information when you put together an intelligence assessment, and it comes down to a distillation process. And as you know, there were two products that were produced, a unclassified version and a highly classified version. And the attempt was to try to include in that highly classified version all of the relevant and pertinent information that needed to be in there in order to undergird the judgments contained. And so was 100% of all of the information available put into that highly classified one? No, but it was taken into account. And so therefore, again, some decisions have to be made about it. But I am unaware that anything was intentionally excluded because of intelligence, that is, that was, for some reason, one of the agencies didn't want in there for a reason that was not a very legitimate intelligence reason.
I think we can discuss that in the executive session. Mr. Gowdy, I yield balance my time to you.
Thank you, my friend from New York. Director Brennan, last time we were talking about at the inception of your investigation in 2016. I want the next question to include the inception, the pendency, up until your very last day at the CIA. Did you see evidence of collusion, coordination, conspiracy between Donald Trump and Russian state actors?
I saw information and intelligence that was worthy of investigation by the Bureau to determine whether or not such cooperation or conclusion was taking place.
That doesn't help us a lot. What was the nature of the information?
As I said, Mr. Gowdy, I think this committee now has access to the type of information that I'm alluding to here. It's classified, and I'm happy to talk about it in classified session.
And that would have been directly between the candidate and Russian state actors?
That's not what I said. I'm not going to talk about any individuals.
But that was my question, and you answered it, and you didn't answer it that way.
No, I responded to your query. I'm not going to respond to particular elements of your question because I think it would be inappropriate for me to do so here. So I can only repeat what I said, which is that I was aware of intelligence and information about contacts between Russian officials and U.S. persons that raised concerns in my mind about whether or not those individuals were cooperating with the Russians either in a witting or unwitting fashion, and that served as the basis for the FBI investigation to determine whether such collusion, cooperation occurred.
All right. Well, there are a bunch of words that start with C floating around. I ask you about collusion, coordination, and conspiracy, and you used the word contact. And I think in a previous answer, you did a really good job of establishing that contact could be benign or not benign. So was it contact that you saw? Was it something more than contact? What is the nature of what you saw?
I saw interaction and aware of interaction that, again, raised questions in my mind about what was the true nature of it. But I don't know. I don't have sufficient information to make a determination whether or not such cooperation or complicity or collusion was taking place. But I know that there was a basis to have individuals pull those threads.
All right, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you saw something that led you to refer it to law enforcement. And in your judgment, it is up to law enforcement to test, probe, corroborate, contradict, otherwise investigate the full nature of that information you passed on. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yes, it is, because it's not CIA's job to make a determination about whether a U.S. person is cooperating, colluding, or whatever in some type of criminal or illegal matter. It is our responsibility to give the Bureau everything that they need in order to follow that path and make such a determination and recommendation if they want to press charges.
All right, we'll pick it up next time.
Ms. Sewell, 5 minutes.
Welcome, Director Brennan. Building on the questions that my colleague, Mr. Himes, talked with you about, I'd like to ask you some more specifics about Russia attacking us and how their attacks specifically cause us to doubt our own credibility as Americans. I'd like to talk about truth and what it means to be truthful to your country if you are in a position of power. Director Brennan, was Putin first within Russia and then against us working to undermine truth? And how exactly has he done that?
Mr. Putin and Russian intelligence services are determined to do what they can to influence